Thank you, Christy, and welcome everybody. This is, I guess, the last session of an exchange we're going to have this year. My name's Dave Shepard. I've been a master naturalist here for a little over 2 years. A little bit about my own background. I'm a retired federal employee, both active duty military and civil service. And since I retired, I've been working with the master naturalist community here in New York. My volunteer work's almost all with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the Iroquois National Wildlife Refuge. If you guys ever get up that way, it's worth a look. Today we're going to be considering the phenomenon of winter dormancy in trees, specifically deciduous trees. And I'll warn you all now, this is going to be an overview. The subject is one that gets quite complicated pretty quickly. So my objective tonight is just going to be simply to introduce the adaptations that go into winter dormancy, along with some of the very basic science that's behind them. Now, what I'm showing you here is just a quick outline of what we'll be talking about tonight. We're going to talk a very little bit about what dormancy is, to kind of define that process. Then we'll talk about the drivers that make dormancy necessary. And we'll talk about some of the adaptations that occur during the dormancy process, the cellular changes, the leaf drop, and the internal clock that regulates the chilling and waking up of the trees during the winter. Now, note that all of these adaptations kind of work in tandem, but they're also essentially stress responses. So it's all about keeping alive during a cold, dark, and a dry period. We're going to finish up with a brief mention of some of the environmental challenges that may drive further changes to how plants manage the winter months. We'll also talk a little bit about a kind of a new development. It's a hypothesis on what may turn out to be a carbon sink limitation that may affect the timing of the autumn senescence and leaf drop. I'd originally intended to do a little bit with seeds, but I'm not going to do that tonight. They're just too complex. I could spend the whole hour on it, so I won't. We'll just do the tree adaptations today. So what is dormancy? Well, in trees, it's not really a process. It's not an on and off switch. It's a series of metabolic adjustments with the seasons that preserves and protects the living cells of the tree that are needed for the growth and propagation of it. The things that it can affect are the growth cessation, which is necessary for the plant to get through the winter, the bud set, the maintenance of initiation and release from dormancy, and the bud break or bud burst, depending on what phrase you like. Now, there are 3 types of dormancy that you're going to run across if you do any research in this.
Yeah, the yoga room would be good.
We have the first of those the types of dormancy is paradormancy, which is a physiological effect that limits growth. The most common example you get are lateral buds on a growing branch. The lateral buds won't develop if the tip is still growing, but if you prune the tip off, those lateral buds will bush out. That's an example of what we call paradormancy. Ecodormancy is dependent on signals from environmental conditions that are exterior to the tree, such as day length and temperature. And the dormancy that's imposed is the extent to which those conditions would inhibit growth. Endodormancy, which we get into in the deep winter, are internal signals from the tree that we turn off that external environmental condition receptor, and the tree relies instead on an internal clock that prevents growth regardless of whatever the external conditions may be. Now, in the graphic there, you'll see that the dormancy is a process. It kind of runs from autumn into spring. So we start with an ecodormant period. Some things you read on this fall period of what we call acclimation, where the tree acclimatizes itself for winter. It refers to that as a paradormancy as well as ecodormancy. So that's why I brought paradormancy into this. I tend to think of it as ecodormancy simply because we are largely dependent on day length here. That will trigger the beginning of that acclimation process to get the tree ready. The deep dormancy is in midwinter. It's called the endodormancy, and that's where we have the internal clocks that the tree relies on to the exclusion of just about everything else. And in the spring, we start a deacclimation process, which takes us back into an ecodormant state and then reverses the changes we did during the fall to get the tree ready to enter a full growth state in the late spring. Now, the fact that we get winter and the difference between liquid water and ice that comes with winter is what compels a lot of the adaptations to actually take place. So winter is really our first driver. Now we know that trees, as in other green plants, make food by using sunlight to power the chemical food factories in their leaves. Now, to do this photosynthesis, they also need an awful lot of liquid water. But the fact of our axial tilt means we get seasons, and the fact of the winter season means that for roughly half the year, the conditions for photosynthesis are less than ideal. So we get sunlight that's not as strong, we get not as many hours of sunlight, we get liquid water that will solidify into ice, as that lower graphic shows there. And when it does, it expands. So the solid ice will break cell membranes, which of course will be fatal to the cell. And finally, we need to realize that the winter is a dry period. The water is bound up as ice. So the tree then has to make trade-offs. It's got to protect that food production machinery or discard it. And it has to do that along with the other adaptations that are necessary for it to survive a sub-freezing winter. So what's a green plant to do? Well, it has basically three choices. It can die after renewing a renewal seed bank, which is what your annuals and to some extent biennials do. It can stay active, and down at the lower, at the more southern regions of a temperate zone, that might not be a bad strategy, since you might not dip below freezing that much. Or the tree can go dormant. Now, trees get a little complicated because they can't die back to the ground. They have to preserve each year's growth. And why do they have to do that? Because they're fighting for sunlight. If you kind of throttle back your time scales to look at the time scales that trees use, which can be decades and centuries, you can observe a very vigorous competition for sunlight in the trees, especially the larger canopy trees. So the issue for them is how to preserve each year's growth and how to solve that maintenance and upkeep problem for the living cells. You know, what energy expenditures they're going to have to make. Now, they solve that problem by imposing some cellular changes to protect the tree's tissue, and by running that internal clock we talked about. We'll talk about both of those a little later on. But first of all, we've got to determine what they do with the leaves, and that's one of the main adaptations that deciduous trees have made. Now, leaves are a lot of expensive, vulnerable living tissue that's going to be hanging out there, exposed to the cold and the dry of a winter season. So for the leaves, nature has evolved two basic solutions. You get evergreens and deciduous plants. Now, each has advantages. Each is expensive in its own way and has disadvantages. So to look at those quickly, non-tropical evergreens tend to use a lot of short, compact, and low surface area leaves that we call needles. And they're coated with a very thick, waxy coating that's is fairly resistant to wind and ice and to freezing temperatures. Now, on the graphic, that upper bit of the graphic there is a cross-section of a pine needle. And you can see that the vascular tissue of the leaf is all fairly deep inside, and and with a waxy coat on, that's actually fairly resistant to low temperatures. Now, the needles are not shed every year, as you know. They're held onto the tree for several years and are shed only when they really outlive their usefulness and really start to die off. So we don't have to renew them every year. Now, a lot of people think that evergreens can photosynthesize all year round, and in one sense they can, but they don't really do a lot of photosynthesizing in cold weather, so they don't get that much of a benefit from it. And the reason for that, of course, is that liquid water is necessary for photosynthesis, and during the winter, liquid water is at a premium. You don't get that much. So the evergreens really slow way down. They don't quite go fully dormant, but they slow way down and reduce their level of photosynthetic activity during the wintertime a very great deal. Now, the benefit to them for all this is that it lowers the construction cost of the leaf production and thus of the food production they have to make. The downside is that even though they've got a lot of needles, it's still then not a whole lot of surface area when compared to the deciduous trees. So the trade-off for the evergreen is you get a lower level of photosynthetic activity over the course of the year. Now, deciduous trees are almost exclusively broadleafed, and that requires a complete shedding and renewal every year. They're great solar panels, but they're flimsy. They don't hold up that well. So the trade-off here and the detriment to the deciduous model is the necessity of renewing at considerable cost to the plant that production facility every year. Now, it was interesting to me when I first started preparing this talk that where the trees can afford that cost, the deciduous model seems to win out. But when in high altitudes or high latitudes, such as the boreal forests up at the northern end of the temperate zone and into the subarctic, or in relatively poor soils, the evergreens tend to win out. All right, the first adaptation that I really want to get into today is the leaf drop itself. Now, what I'm going to concentrate now almost exclusively on the deciduous model. The shutdown that the leaves do here, they just don't fall off the tree. It's an orderly shutdown and deconstruction of the leaf that occurs in tandem with the other ecodormancy actions that help prepare the tree for the rest period of the winter. So what happens? The chlorophyll production is stopped. The chlorophyll doesn't renew itself, so it senesces, and you start to notice that the leaves lose the green. And that other pigments become apparent. So the sugars and the nutrients that remain in the leaf are taken back into the trunk and the branches for reuse and into the roots for a winter food store. The nitrogen from the chloroplasts is reclaimed for use in building the chlorophyll next season. Those of you who know about the chlorophyll molecule will know that the chlorophyll is heavy with nitrogen atoms. It's got a nitrogen ring around it that is probably the guts of the chlorophyll engine. Now, when we do leaf drop in a deciduous tree, it's not a simple switch on or a switch off. We just don't drop the leaves, but it's a process of deconstructing these leaves that balances the energy needed to do it with the deconstruction itself. So you're going to get some chlorophyll continuing to be active to fuel that shutdown. Now, a consequence of this is that you get a light imbalance. So that is, the leaves continue to lose their chlorophyll and continue to have their starches and nitrogen and so on pulled back into the tree itself. The leaves are less and less able to absorb and use that sunlight that hits them. So the consequence is that you arrive at some sun damage to the leaves. which is going to get in the way of the remaining chlorophyll feeding the deconstruction process, if not get in the way of the deconstruction process itself. Now, once the leaf shutdown is complete, there are hormonal changes that occur in the boundary layer of the cells at the base of the leaf, and that hardens it off and seals it off. That's the abscission layer. And once it forms, fluids no longer pass between leaf and twig, and the leaf gets discarded. Now, what that does for the tree is it prevents an open wound and prevents water loss. Those same growth hormones now do something else. They not only cause the abscission layer to harden off as the leaf finishes its deconstruction process, but it also shuts down cell division at the ends of the twigs and branches that are those growing ends, which is where the leaves are. And that is the growth cessation process that the tree goes through. Now, I've mentioned the fact that we see different pigments that show up during the leaf drop, and so what are all these different pigments telling us? The color changes are a result of differing levels of various pigments. Now, all leaves, we've already gone over that the leaves will have the chlorophyll decay away and won't renew it after that acclimation process starts. But all leaves will experience chlorophyll deterioration loss over the growing season. That's normal, but it's not to the point where you start to notice a loss of the chlorophyll. This process is accelerated greatly as the acclimation process begins and the leaf drop actually starts and comes to be. But once triggered, that chlorophyll will diminish, and the stuff of the leaf will show up their pigments, which are called the carotenoids, and those are what give the leaf a yellowy color. So when you see the yellows, those are the carotenoids. Those pigments are always present. It's just basically the stuff of that leaf husk that eventually gets discarded. Now, in the fall, we also have a combination of bright sun and cool temperatures that occurs. The sunlight actually is quite clear during the autumn, and that results in the active synthesis of the other pigments, the red and purple hue pigments that are called the anthocyanins. Now, this is kind of curious because for a couple of reasons. First is where we see the anthocyanins the most is on the leaves that are fully exposed to the sunlight. If you go up a tree and not quite to that outer shell of leaves, the leaves that are somewhat shaded, the anthocyanins aren't as prevalent. The colors look a little muddy. But out where the sun can hit them, the colors are quite vibrant. But these pigments are actually manufactured in the leaf during the leaf drop process. Well, the leaf itself is dying, and the tree is going to shed it in a couple weeks or so. So why would we spend yet more energy building these pigments in there if we're just going to get rid of them? Well, that's where we get into the possible functions of what the fall color is telling us. Now, we were taught that color, at least when I went to school, what I learned was that color was an accident of the sugars left over when the leaf died. So rather than an essential part of the whole process, it was just more or less an accident. Gave us pretty colors. But now it seems that the thinking is that these colors, particularly the anthocyanins, may have specific benefits. I'm going to concentrate on anthocyanins right now, just because that's where I think it's the best example. I mentioned that we have formed a light imbalance in the leaf as the leaf drop process commences and continues on. And we have a lot of sunlight hitting these leaves, which can do some damage to it. So my suspicion, and this has been sort of borne out by some other evidence in some studies, is that the anthocyanins form an antioxidant and a sunscreen. In other words, they will help prevent that sun damage from really occurring and help the leaf squeeze that last bit of food out of the decaying cell to get everything we can out of the leaf into the tree itself for use next year. So we reduce the cost to the tree of trying to build a whole new food production facility from scratch. We have a lot of raw materials that we've been able to salvage and save. I think this is particularly likely in that where we see the anthocyanins the most is in the leaves that are most fully exposed to the sun. Finally, while the studies that have tried to confirm this have been equivocal, they don't really confirm it, they don't really disprove it, but we do know that anthocyanins do act as a sunscreen during the springtime. Now, what I'm going to suggest to you is that this coming spring, when we start to break dormancy and the leaves start to break their buds and unfurl a little bit, go out and take a good look at them. And you'll see a little shot of red through the leaves on a lot of species. And that red is an anthocyanin. It does act as a sunscreen. It allows the leaf to harden off. And then after the leaf is out for a day or two and does harden off, so is able to tolerate the conditions outside, that anthocyanin pigment goes away. Now there are some other suggested functions that leaf coloration can serve. There's that are largely biological. One is it's a leaf camouflage. You want to prevent an herbivore from eating the leaf, so it while you're trying to deconstruct it, so it turns a different color. It can serve as a fruit flag to lure the creatures in that might want to eat the fruit, and they'll find the nuts and so on and do that. That one's not very likely, simply because most of the trees are done with their fruiting by the time we get to the leaf drop. Or you could have the leaf turning color as a revealing or association strategy to prevent insect damage. The revealing strategy would be to defeat the insect camouflage by showing it up, or by looking like the leaf is well protected, has a toxin in it, so if it's eaten, it will basically scare off or deter an herbivore from trying to eat it. Okay, now just a quick note on the extent of coloration. Very often we're asked, well, if we had if these trees get really red and these trees get really yellow, are we going to have a good year every year? The answer is we don't know. We can't tell. There are a lot of variables that go into what the basic color ends up looking like in any given year. And it's going to vary from year to year. Things like temperature, moisture levels, degree of sunlight, soil can affect what the colors will be. Soil composition, possibly, although that's not really is suspected to be that much of a factor. So there, from year to year, there are going to be differences in what the tree is going to present. Some years are going to be better for deconstructing the leaf than others, and you're going to get different degrees of green left in the leaf, which will affect, I'm sorry, the pigments that the leaf ends up showing. Okay, the second adaptation, I think, that is worth discussion here is the cellular changes that occur in the tree itself. Now, when we talk about a tree surviving the winter, that we have to remember that the danger is to the living cells. And while we may think of trees as huge living things, in a mature tree, you're only dealing with maybe 1 or maybe 2% that's biologically alive, and it's that portion that needs protection. Now, on the graphic here, I've given you both a cross section and a longitudinal diagram of a hardwood. And the living tissue is the phloem and the cambium that goes right around the rim of the tree, just inside the bark. And the cambium is what, of course, what gives you the growth ring. The phloem is what transfers the sugars down from the leaves. And the xylem inside the cambium is no longer alive. Those are just shells of the cells that used to be. But they're hooked together end to end as in pipes, and they serve to draw water and other nutrients up from the roots up into the crown. Now, the living cells, as we start the acclimation process and begin to move into dormancy, the living cells are changed, and they're changed in two fashions. One, they allow permeability, and the second is they allow some flexibility. Now, the permeability will allow them to lose some of their water out into the interstitial spaces between the cells in the stem of the tree, and into the areas of the tree that are no longer alive. What they will also do, what permeability also does, it allows the cells to draw in some soluble compounds such as the sugars and the starches, which mix with the water and form basically a form of antifreeze. And is that, when you do that, what you end up getting is an intracellular fluid, the fluid remaining in the cells that it becomes almost supercooled. It becomes thick and viscous, kind of like molasses or maple syrup, and is a little more resistant to freezing, since the freezing point has been lowered a bit. Now, over time now, as the temperature drops outside the trees, we'll find that the antifreeze-like fluid inside the cells will resist freezing, while the water that is now outside of the cells, but just mingled in amongst the no longer living tissue in the sapwood and heartwood of the tree, forms an ice jacket. So that water will freeze. The interstitial fluid will freeze first, and that ice jacket will provide an insulating layer. Now, that combined with the supercooled fluid inside that remains inside the cell gives you quite a bit of protection from freezing and from the cold. Now, the second change that happens to the cell wall is the flexibility. And this is actually pretty simple. As the water moves out of the cell, it shrinks a little bit, becomes a little bit desiccated, and the flexibility of the cell allows it to move around in response to pressure. So the freezing of the water outside the cell, if it presses against it, isn't going to result in rupturing the cell wall. And of course, we've got kind of an antifreeze inside the cell, so we don't have to worry about it there either. So yeah, think of a grape. If you take a grape between your fingers and press it, you're going to rupture it. But a raisin, you can kind of wiggle around. So that's how I've thought of it. Now, there are limitations with this. If you get too cold, that intracellular fluid is going to freeze anyway, and the plant's going to sustain some damage. But what we've just described here, these changes that occur to the cell structure of the tree itself are what give the tree its cold hardiness. Now, there is another thing that I found very intriguing, was that the tree also uses the heat of the state change of the water turning to ice. There's a little burst of heat that you can, if you try to measure these things, you can actually see that little burst of heat as the state changes from liquid to a solid. The living cells will take that heat and use it to help get through that initial burst of cold. Finally, in some species, particularly maples, you have mixed into that interstitial fluid, you have an insulating gas like carbon dioxide. It's part of that cocktail, and it will assist in keeping the ice from expanding too much. It will also assist in keeping the living cells insulated from too much cold. All right, now that when these when these factors all come together, this is what we call cold hardiness. I said that already. Okay, the third adaptation that I want to talk about is what I call chilling out. That's effectively what the tree does. Up until now, we've talked about what the tree is doing through the acclimation period of ectodormancy. Now, when we get all the leaf drop finished and the cellular changes are done, now we're into endodormancy, where we turn off the receptor that reads external conditions, and we start running, and we start a clock running. And while that clock is running, the tree is going to remain asleep. It's going to remain dormant, even if external conditions are favorable for growth. Now, what endodormancy does, it measures a thing called chill units, or it's thought of in chill hours sometimes. And those chill hours are biologically necessary to prepare the plant for flowering when the cues become right in the spring. And what it implies is there's that internal control that's independent of external conditions. Now, having said that, I will tell you that you can force a plant out of endodormancy, but the plant doesn't like it much. And we'll talk about what happens if you try to do that in the next slide or two. But for now, when you're in that endodormancy, you're in that deep dormancy state, you're counting off the
Christy, you're muted.
Thank you. I just said I didn't know what happened to Dave. Seem to have lost him.
Yeah, I got a loud squeal from his mic, and then all of a sudden he was gone.
Yeah, I had a funny vibrating sound.
I had a truffa sound, and then it stopped.
Yeah, that's exactly what it sounded like.
Good description.
It was really good. Let me shoot him an email.
Yeah, I was thinking, did he really say that?
Hey, Chrissy, I don't know what happened.
Oh, you're back. I was just sending you an
Welcome
email.
back.
Yeah, not sure what happened. We just dropped Seth's computer, just turned off.
Yeah, okay, no worries. You can just
So,
go ahead and screen share. And we heard an interesting sound, which Alice described perfectly. She can tell you what it sounded like when we lost you.
Yeah, it sounded like truffa.
okay.
Those darn Russians.
No, I don't think so. I did take a couple years. Yeah, I did take a couple years of Russian, but that doesn't do it. And Christy, I'm having trouble screen sharing here.
You are. Oh, you may have lost your co-host status there. Okay, try now, Dave.
Right now?
Mm-hmm.
Well, what would help, I guess, is if I got the presentation up. That would always help. And today 442. Microsoft. Open. Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. There we go. Okay, is my screen shared at this point?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yes. there you go.
All right, we're back. I am sorry about that, and I don't know what happened.
No worries. These are the days.
No, whatever. So we were talking about the chill hours, and I think we were to the point where the chill hours are measuring the periods during which the temperature is between freezing and about 10 degrees Celsius, or about 45 degrees Fahrenheit. And anything above that is going to result in the internal clock actually regressing a bit. So it's going to, when the temperature drops back down again, it's going to have to make that up. And any temperatures below freezing really don't count for the chill unit accumulation. Now, the effect of this, of course, is to keep the thing from keep the tree from waking up in the midwinter warm spell, and they're getting blasted with a late killing frost. But once those chill units have been accumulated and the clock has run out, then the tree shifts back into an ecodormancy state and begins the acclimation process. And what happens there is we start to undo those cellular changes, which we've done to get the tree ready for endodormancy, and we turn back on the receptor that looks at outside environmental conditions like day length and soil temperature, and we'll basically go into standby until the conditions are good for growth, at which point the tree will break dormancy and break its buds and spread its leaves and do its blooming and all that. Okay, now it's unclear really as to precisely what runs out the clock and allows a tree to re-enter ecodormancy during that deacclimation period in early spring. We know it's tied to hormonal signals. We know but what genetic processes regulate them really isn't that well understood. But as that deacclimation process starts and the ecodormancy signals move toward optimal growth conditions, the sap will start to rise. A combination of root pressure, the soil temperature rises, and the root pressure will then begin to force that water up. The structure of the xylem will itself pull that water up a little bit, and the difference in the fluids in the xylem and the phloem will exert a pressure of its own that will get that fluid up into the branches. As the process continues, that growth hormone cocktail further adjusts to prepare the living cells for a resumed growth and bud break. And this, by the way, is how maple syrup producers know when to stop. Just prior to bud break, the sap takes on a very woody taste, a very bitter taste. Now, on the graphic there, you can see that this tree has already just broken dormancy. You see the scales on the buds have pulled back, The buds are beginning to unfurl a little bit. You can see just the tips of the leaves beginning to show out there. And you can also see that little shot of red I was telling you about. All right, finally, want to talk to you a little about, before we do that, a couple things, yeah, I can't forget that. A couple things I need to cover. You need to be aware that the chill requirements are dependent in part on where the tree is used to growing. So it's dependent on part on location. Inadequate chill hours, if you don't get enough, can result in a delayed foliation, so that the tree will try to break dormancy. It won't be ready to break dormancy, and you won't get a very good leaf growth. You'll get a reduced fruit set as well. And in fruit trees, you may get something that's known as buttoning, where the fruit sets but then doesn't grow. And if you were to take that down and cut it open and look at the seed in there, you would find that the seed is dead. It's not dormant, it's just dead. Now, as far as how many chill hours your particular tree or vine is going to need, there's a lot of empirical work been done. So we have a pretty good clue for how much time is needed for this cultivar or that cultivar. And I would start with my local cooperative extension services, because they usually have chill calculators that are accurate enough. But as far as what drives them or what actually releases that endodormancy trigger, that's still not really well known. Finally, there is something that the chilling requirements do. It's a final function that they serve. They also enable flowering and seed production. Now, this was first studied by the Russians back in the 1920s when they were looking at cereals cultivation. They realized that plants, trees, or in their case cereals, would have to go through a period of cold in order to flower and set their fruits and drop seeds. And the lead scientist there coined the term yarovizatsia. There's your Russian. And that has been translated as vernalization. So think winterizing something for springtime. That's basically what that chilling period does for plants as they are getting ready to flower. It's a very, very well-known requirement for fruit trees, especially peaches and stone fruits. So the lesson there is, when you're buying trees, buy them local, buy them from a local nursery. Don't get them from out of area. All right, and that is pretty much dormancy from beginning of acclimation through end of deacclimation. There is the final couple points I'd like to make. Any ecosystem is comprised, of course, of a web of interrelationships, and the forest ecosystems are becoming under a lot of stress these days from climate change and invasive species and so on. As we've talked about winter dormancy, we can, I think, fairly quickly extrapolate the effects that climate change may have on orchards and vineyards. As the forest types are going to migrate to higher latitudes and higher altitudes, vineyards and orchards are going to get left behind. So trees that are used to requiring a certain number of chill hours might not get them. And we just went over what can happen to trees if they do not get the requisite number of chill hours and are forced into breaking dormancy too early. There is, however, what we thought would be a silver lining, in that with a longer growing season and more carbon dioxide in the air, trees would have a higher photosynthetic productivity and would therefore fix more carbon. And there have been Harvard's done some work that suggests that does occur. But this study is very recent, came out just last month by Dr. Zani and her colleagues over in Zurich, Switzerland. They have concluded differently. They conclude that climate change may actually induce earlier leaf drop than later. Now, what they did was they took, examined 6 species of trees over a period 1948 through the present, examined the data for that on the growing seasons, looked at high photosynthetic productivity years and low photosynthetic productivity years, and found that there was a correlation between that and the trees entering autumn leaf drop. So that in high productivity years, they would enter leaf drop earlier instead of later. Little counterintuitive there. They did laboratory experiments to confirm that, and the laboratory work did in fact confirm that correlation. Now, so the conclusion they drew was that trees can only fix so much carbon. It's the analogy they use is going to a big dinner and you eat your fill and you can't eat anymore, but there's still plenty of food on the table. So if the trees do get full, the leaves become very costly to keep, so the tree just packs it in a little early. And they suspect that the autumn senescence is going to advance by as much as 7 or 8 days, maybe longer. Right. Finally, a word on invasive species. We've had a lot of bush honeysuckle, autumn olive, and European buckthorn has established itself up here and is doing its best to take over. These species, of course, are very vigorous, and they leaf out early, they hold their leaves longer, and they create pretty dense shade pits. And of course, they change the soil chemistry a little bit. So when I've listened to our biologists at the refuge and some of the foresters that I've worked with there, they talk about restoring the forest. They're not trying to restore what was. They're looking at what kind of forest is going to come up later and what are we going to have to do to adjust. So climate change is only going to hasten that process, and watch the space, because we really don't know what affect the winter dormancy may have as a result of that. All right, so with that, that's all I have for you tonight. That study from Dr. Zani, I have a link to it. It's here on the page. It's also in the chat box. It's a little 3-minute clip on YouTube where they explain their work and what they've done. So when you play it, be sure you keep the subtitles on. She speaks beautiful English, but the accent is very, very thick, and you might lose a little bit of it if you're not ready for it. So with that, Christy, I will turn it back to you. I will entertain your questions. I can't guarantee I can answer them, but I'll certainly entertain them.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. That was a lot of really great information. There are a couple questions in the chat box.
Okay.
First is from Lori Dittmer. She wants to know, how can we tell when the fruit tree is in full dormancy so it is safe to winter prune and not risk growth and winter kill?
How can you tell when it's in full, when the fruit trees are in full dormancy? Normally, I would wait until you've had a good solid frost or freeze, and the leaves are all off. That's a pretty good clue. To me, it sounds like the danger is in winter kill, though, might be by trying to prune too late rather than too early. So you're going to risk trying to prune it back when the tree's trying to start to wake up. But other than that, as far as really being able to tell, I think I would be talking to my cooperative extension about that.
Okay. And for the people who I'm reading the questions for, if you have further follow-ups, feel free to unmute and ask Dave yourself. Liz Herman asks, are there horticultural practices that involve forcing trees the same way that people often force bulbs?
Yes, actually, that's one of the dangers of prolonged winter warm snap, is that will naturally force the tree. And when we check to see if a tree is coming out of ecodormancy and is coming, or endodormancy is going back into ecodormancy, one of the ways they do it is to take cuttings. And then they try to force them in a greenhouse. And if you get more than 50% bud break, you've got sufficient chill hours. That's how they measure it.
Okay. Gary asks, in an endodormant tree, what part of the tree or what cells keep track of chill hours?
That's one of those things that we really don't know the answer to, I'm afraid. I don't even know that it's necessarily a question of which cells do it. It may be hardwired into the genetics and the hormone balances that the tree does. But yeah, all we really know for sure is that the tree does keep that clock. And now it may be that as the hormones have changed over the course of the fall acclimation period, and that we finally enter endodormancy, then the hormones will very slowly start to revert back to a state more compatible with growth. And at the end of that state, that they may come out of endodormancy. That's one theory I've seen. I don't know how true it is. So I guess my short answer is I'm really not sure how that works. And you know, if anybody can find any studies, I'd be delighted to know.
Okay, thank you. Dave, I had a question. In that new study from Science that you shared with us, they're predicting that autumn senescence is going to happen sooner, but climate change has been already occurring for quite some time. Is there any evidence? Do they have evidence that that has been happening in certain locations?
None other than the empirical data they took from the years they looked at, because it was started in 48 and then of course ran all the way through the present. So you would have encompassed about 10, 15 years of a climate change environment already. So I dare say that was probably part of what they found. But they, in all 6 of the trees they looked at, the correlation was between, enhanced photosynthesis productivity year and an early autumn senescence. It was pretty pronounced.
All right, thank you. Jim Cole asks, he says, I've noticed during the last several years that summer seems to be longer. There are more warmer days in September, October, and November. It almost seems that the leaves are turning brown before dropping. Any thoughts? Well,
a brown leaf coloration usually means that the shutdown's not complete, and you've got some chlorophyll left over there that's mixing with the anthocyanin. That's what gives you that brownish color. That can also happen when you get a freeze that hits the leaf prematurely, but I don't think that was his question. I mean, he's talking about warmer weather in the fall, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So my guess is that for whatever reason, you're not getting a complete shutdown and deconstruction of the leaf before the abscission layer forms and it falls.
Okay. Paul Siskin asks, when you suggested that buying trees that were raised locally is better because their chill hour clock is set, does this mean that it's set during the first few years, or is it set by genetics and only those seedlings will survive to saleable size?
It's set by genetics. I mean, that everything I've read points that way. And that seems to be the general consensus now, is that all this is genetically regulated, with the hormones turning the genetic switches on and off. it's just a quick story that kind of supports my advice to buy a tree locally. We had, if you do any kind of research in this, you'll find the stories of the peach tree cultivars, that were bred specifically to grow in South Florida and Central Florida and South Texas. And those cultivars do just fine. They're a stone fruit, so they're going to need some chilling, but they've been bred specifically not to need much. So they get their chill hours quickly, they break early, they have a good fruit set and all that in Central Florida. You grow them at points north into Georgia, let's say, where the winters are a bit harsher, and they get their chill hours early and they wake up early and they get whacked with a late frost. You'll see this orchard of trees just starting to bud break with 1 or 2 trees of this particular cultivar just in full bloom. Also, the kind of a personal story, when we lived in Virginia, we had, I tried to grow some tulip poplars, or tulip trees up here, they call them. And I got one that was a gift to me from a friend that lived in North Carolina, southern North Carolina. So we planted it, and every year it would break early. And every year it would sustain some frost damage from a late frost. And it finally died. It just couldn't tolerate the year after year after year after year of breaking early. Well, it was a tulip tree. It was Lyriodendron tulipifera. It was the same as the tulip trees I had that I transplanted out of the woods. The ones I transplanted did fine. But that one I got from North Carolina did not.
Interesting. Let's see, Alice asks, she mentions in 2012, we had an unseasonably warm March with about a week of 80 degrees. The trees started flowering. Then there was a hard frost and the flowers all died. Also, there was a drought that summer and the apple crop was atrocious. Is it possible for the disastrous tree reaction to be prevented? If so, how would that look?
Well, before we can prevent any tree from reacting that way, we've got to figure out really clearly genetically what makes it tick. What you describe with the very warm spell in March, that the tree was already in ectodormancy, was getting ready to break anyhow, but it had one of those years where the warm weather came a little early, and so it broke a little early, and then you got the killing frost. Not uncommon, actually, for trees that are that are acclimated with a chill requirement for a particular area that breaks, that's used to breaking in mid-March to late March. If you get a warm spell in early March, that could easily happen, because you're already in the deacclimation process, starting to rework that hormonal cocktail to get it ready to go, and the receptors of temperature and soil temperature apparently rose a little too fast and caused the tree to break. That will happen in late winter, early spring. By contrast, when that will not happen is if you get a warm spell, say for 4 or 5 days right after New Year's. Because one year when we were still in Virginia, we had a nice cold December, everything went down, was clearly in dormancy. And then after New Year's, we had 5 days of 70-degree weather. And we were scared to death we were going to lose stuff. And not much broke. Had a couple things, but they were warm weather plants anyway. But the big trees, everything, not even close, not even bud swelling.